This video will be part 3 of my coverage of Carl Rogers' Person-Centered Perspective, Chapter 11 for PSY 230, Personality Theory. Last time we talked about the basic human needs for positive self-regard and for positive regard. So we need to view ourselves positively, and we also need other people to view us positively. And those are seen as prerequisites for being able to continue to grow and to self-actualize. Developmentally, Rogers talked about there being either unconditional love and positive regard or conditional positive regard, with unconditional positive regard fostering positive, healthy growth and development, and conditional positive regard fostering unhealthy or pathological growth and development. So in this part of the lecture, we're going to start by talking about what kind of environment fosters unhealthy growth and development, and that would be conditional positive regard. Rogers argued that culture, society, the world that surrounds you may suggest to you that there are only certain ways that you can behave that will lead to you being loved and valued and respected, and basically thought of positively. So conditional positive regard is treatment that leaves you feeling that only some of your behaviors, some of your thoughts, some of your feelings will be valued by others around you whose opinion matters. So obviously, parents, teachers, siblings, friends, people who have impact on you directly, when they provide you conditional positive regard, it means that they will love and accept you, they will respond to you positively only when you live within the boundaries of the image that they expect. Now, go back to Karen Horney's model, where you have an internalized, idealized image of self that is caused by other people around the person suggesting you need to be this way, and unless you're this way, I will not accept you. And that's essentially conditional positive regard. Behaviors, expressions, wishes, attitudes, thoughts, feelings, any of those things that are expressed naturally, but if they're not valued by others and the expectation is communicated to a person that they have to be replaced by other behaviors or attitudes, that becomes what are called conditions of worth. Again, remember back to Karen Horney's theory where she talked about the tyranny of the shoulds. That's very similar to what Rogers is arguing here with conditions of worth. When you're expected to behave in a certain way or express attitudes of a certain form that really go against an aspect of who you really are, the self, the aspects of the self that are intuitively natural for you, but you're expected to behave otherwise, those are called conditions of worth. And they're deeply invalidating. And that's kind of an essential quality of conditions of worth, that they're invalidating. When this happens, the self-concept then becomes connected to that idealized image of self that is defined by these very artificial conditions of worth. And when self-concept becomes built that way, it is essentially an idealized image of self. It's very restrictive in terms of its standards, and it's functionally unattainable because it goes against who you really are. These standards or conditions of worth that decide what's valuable and not valuable, when they are so discrepant from who you really are underneath, those are the conditions under which neurosis arises. This leads to anxiety. Go back to Karen Horney's basic anxiety construct. Rogers is not saying something that's all that much different from that. We feel anxiety in a general sense because whenever we have an impulse to move in an authentic, growth-oriented way, but the world around us doesn't accept that positive, growth-oriented impulse in you, it's going to trigger the idea that the world is going to reject you if you express what's natural to you. And that trigger then produces anxiety, which Rogers described as a cue, essentially, that you're going to, if you act in a way that's consistent with your internal real self, the world around you is going to declare you unworthy. So now you're in a situation of conflict, and that's really, for Rogers, the source of our neurosis. Conditions of worth lead to what Rogers called a state of incongruence, where, remember those overlapping circles, where if you are in a state of incongruence between your inherent potentials, your real self, and the self-concept as it's currently living in the world, where you've been trying to live up to the conditions of worth that have been imposed upon you, you're going to have that incongruent state where not only are you experiencing incongruence between inherent potentials and the self-concept, you're also experiencing incongruence in your expressions, your communications, and your behaviors. Incongruence between what's actually being propelled out into the world, but what that's incongruent with what you feel is necessary for you to be authentic. What this all leads to is a false self-image. Now go back again, keep saying this, to Horney's model. When people are forced towards self-realization, that's authentic. When they are forced towards self-idealization, that's inauthentic. So when people are forced into, via conditional positive regard, this false self-image, they feel invalidated. These conditions of worth, when they are repeatedly experienced, what you have is the foundation of self-image is built on these false productions, this false self. My student that I used as an example in the last video, who felt, she really worked so hard to live up to the goals that had been communicated to her as the right goals to have, becoming a doctor. And, in her family, she had older siblings who already were physicians. She had younger siblings who were following this mold too, and it was really expected she'd be a health professional. And she'd heard that in her entire life. And that was essentially the conditions of worth that had been supplied for her. And she repeatedly experienced the message, how are you doing? Are you taking your courses? Are you doing well in your courses so that you can meet this goal that we have for you to continue in the family model of becoming a doctor? And what she kept experiencing was this pattern of having to suppress the joy she felt when she was doing other things that were more authentic to her, and the disappointment that she felt when she was doing things that were consistent with the conditions of worth imposed on her. What that led to was a false self-image. And, very thinly veiled under the surface, a great deal of pain and anxiety. In order to keep the self-image functioning, the person has to continue to lie to themselves. So again, my student had to constantly reinforce for herself that being a doctor was what she actually wanted. So she had to spend a great deal of time pretending that she was on the right track and that these other kinds of interests that she had were just distractions. They were actually a sign that she wasn't focusing enough. So she kept having to distort her experiences of what she was learning so that it fit with the model that she had always expected of herself and that her family expected of her too. The more distortion there was, the more conflict you experience. So the greater the distortion, the greater chance that you're going to screw up. And that can cause more problems and more distress, a greater possibility of depression. So my student, who I'm using as an example here, she eventually reached a crisis point during her junior year, during the second semester of her junior year, when her parents were, still sending the message, we're proud of you, you're going to be an amazing doctor, you're going to get into the best med school. Simultaneously, she wasn't sleeping, she was having headaches, she was anxious all the time, and her grades were starting to suffer in her core courses, in her discipline, in her pre-med program of study. She was really at an emotional and physical crisis point. And for Rogers, his interpretation would be, you're having these experiences of distress, of anxiety, of not being able to sleep because you're living an inauthentic life and you're using excessive amounts of energy propping up a false self-image that has no foundation. And what the conclusion that she came to was that she needed to shed the false self-image. She needed to come clean with her parents, that she was desperately unhappy, and move in a different direction. And that's, exactly what she did. Because each time people experience this incongruence, it's like just a little hit and another hit and another hit. And every experience of incongruence makes you less balanced. It can increase anxiety, it increases defensiveness, it increases the tendency to block new information. As a whole, it blocks growth. So it tends to lead to more and more anxiety and more dissatisfaction and more of a sense of living a falsehood. Rogers really believed that ultimately people will come to a crisis point where they either have to completely become deluded or they have to move in a new direction. And given his overwhelmingly positive beliefs, he tended to think people would move in that positive, growth-oriented direction. Unconditional positive regard, in contrast to conditional positive regard, involves the tendency to allow people to be flawed, but more importantly, allow people to be individuals. So, as the little cartoon suggests, dogs are going to be dogs. They're going to make messes. They're going to make dirt and hair everywhere. They're going to chew on things they shouldn't chew on. They're going to smell bad. But we love them anyway. So the message that Rogers states here is that you can avoid the pitfalls of a false self-image that's built on no foundation if you have an environment that by and large values you regardless of the paths you choose, that values you for who you really are in your authentic form. So if you're a person who places conditional or positive regard on others, you're demanding that they be what you want them to be. That forces them into a mold that's probably pretty uncomfortable for them. Instead, if you value them for who they are in their wholeness, there will be things you like and don't like about them, but you love them anyway. What that allows is for that person to continue to grow. So what this means from Rogers' point of view is that when the critical people in your life love, value, and respect you as a whole, they don't have to love everything you do. They don't have to love everything you say. They don't have to love every choice you make. But they have to love, value, and respect your whole entity, even if they disagree with your expressions, with your behaviors, and so on. Now, this doesn't mean, and this is a common misconception, this does not mean that parents shouldn't discipline their children. That is actually not what Rogers said. Some people criticized Rogers and said, so what you mean is we're supposed to just let children run wild and do whatever they want and discover themselves, even while they're being wildly inappropriate. Absolutely not. Rogers felt that instead, while you are showing your children that there are boundaries and limitations to their behaviors, there are ways in which you have to socialize children to be moral and to be kind and to be loving, what you are sending, the message you're sending is, I love you as a whole entity. I'm going to show you through my own behavior how to behave in a positive way toward others. Simultaneously, I will show you that even when I disagree with your behaviors and I show you a more appropriate way to act, I still love you as a whole being, right? So he was not a proponent of permissive parenting at all. He instead argued that people need to, forgive the trite phrase, lead by example. So they have to live by being empathetic, by being open, by being loving, and especially by showing unconditional positive regard. By showing another unconditional positive regard, you are not setting up conditions under which they will be valued by you. So whether you're talking about a parent loving their child or a partner loving their partner in an intimate relationship, or just friends who love and value each other as friends, the goal, if you want to be a growth promoter for your children, if you want to be a growth promoter for your spouse or for your friend, what you're striving toward is not setting up conditions of worth. So you're not going to say to your friend, you know what, I'll value you if you do this and don't do that. Now, obviously, there are limitations to that. If someone is abusive of you, if they are cruel to you, having no conditions of worth under those circumstances is inappropriate. However, if you're going to want to be the person who is supportive of the growth and development of someone you care for, you don't want to be the person who sets up conditions of worth that present boundaries to them discovering who they really are. The value of unconditional positive regard is that it allows for congruence to occur. Congruence is our natural state for Rogers. So what you are striving toward is a real self that allows the inherent potentials, the inherent uniqueness in the individual to come to the surface and be manifest in the person's own experiences, their own actions, their own communications. So what you need is an environment that says, explore that, discover it, manifest it. What you don't want is someone who says, hey, you know what, I've decided how you should be. You aren't to discover anything. You are to be this. That leads to conditions of worth, and it leads to incongruence. So in order to, say, parent effectively in Rogers' world, you need to say to yourself as a parent, I am on a journey to discover who my child is and who they need to be. Instead of, say, imposing, I'm going to make you be X, Y, and Z, I'm going to wait to discover which letters of the alphabet my child actually is. Because they may be, I and M and Q instead. And what a surprise would that be? So he argued more for that. Your job as a good parent is the same as your job as a good therapist, is to provide a safe environment for self-discovery on the part of the person you love and value. Now, to put this in a visual context, you have these basic needs for self-actualization, and you have a need for positive regard. Now, in this particular graphic, you could replace need for self-actualization with need for self-regard, or you could add it, so / need for self-regard. You also need others to value you. Now, both of those needs are expressed in the context of other people's responses. If you are expressing both your need for self-actualization, your need for self-regard, and your need for positive regard from others, and you receive unconditional positive regard. So you're searching, you're looking, you're trying to discover, and people value you for doing so, and they support your exploration. That leads to growth, or as Rogers puts it, self-actualization. If, however, you are met with conditions of worth, that's going to create discrepancies. You could think another example would be a parent. I showed horses for years in my childhood and my youth, and there were some horse show parents who were great, and they didn't live through the performance of their kids, but there were horse show parents who clearly were living through their kids. So you had a kid who may or may not actually like riding, and they definitely didn't like competing, but their parents did, or one parent did. So basically, you could have a kid who's just trying to make their parents happy, and they're trying to be successful, and what they're met with when they don't succeed is rigid criticism and demands. That's like the epitome of conditional positive regard. So when kids won trophies, their parents were overjoyed and took lots of pictures and posted them on social media. When their kids were unsuccessful, they were met with criticism, what they did wrong, how they failed, and how embarrassing it was. That's all conditional positive regard. Now, another way of looking at this, and I'm fond of graphics, Rogers defines neurosis in the context of incongruence. So when you look at the neurotic and you compare an ideal self versus a real self, the real self has positive self-regard, meaning high self-esteem, high self-efficacy, a sense of one's own worth that's internalized. And when you have positive regard coming from others, you experience that others value you regardless. Now, notice the arrows here. When people are moving toward actualization and it's coming from themselves, that leads to what's called organismic valuing, which is a fancy way of saying you trust your gut to tell you what direction to take. That supports and is supported by positive regard coming from others, which supports and is supported by positive self-regard. That leads to a real self that is congruent with inherent potentials. Neurosis comes from society, which should be in quotes, which includes important socialization agents, particularly parents, who can set up conditions of worth. That is then given to people in the form of conditional positive regard. That leads to conditional positive self-regard, meaning you only like yourself when you live up to the conditions of worth that have been set out for you by others. That leads to self-idealization, which translates into incongruent neurosis. This graphic is imperfect, but what it does, it kind of shows you this trajectory. Now, there's always going to be, in this model, some conflict, some tug and pull between actualization and the power of external socializing agents who are pushing and pulling. Rogers believed that this push toward actualization is always going to be there. It's going to push up from inside of you, even when there are incredibly powerful socializing agents trying to tell you to stop listening. So he really felt that over the lifespan, the need to self-actualize is going to continue to express itself. It's going to continue to push its way in, whether we like it or not. And he felt that that's one reason why people often crashed in midlife after, so far in their adulthood, people have just struggled and struggled to maintain the falsehood, and they've finally crashed in exhaustion, and they can't fight what is inside of them pushing them in another direction any longer. And then they often end up in therapy, was his argument. Now, the next section of your chapter discusses what does Rogers see as a description of adult functioning. And this is kind of different in comparison to what we've looked at so far in the models that we've seen, which are often really focused on childhood and adolescence and growth in those settings. Now, and even Bandura's model tends to focus a little more on younger people. Kelly, not so much. He was more interested in adult functioning, but in a very cognitivist context. Rogers was really interested in grown-ups and how they function. So when he talked about mature ways of knowing, he's getting at when people are fully functional, when they are mature, when they are actualizing, you have to break apart knowledge and knowing in more than one form. So you have what he called subjective knowing. So this is, knowledge of yourself. When I ask people, tell me about yourself, it's usually subjective knowing is what they give me. You can think about dates that you've gone on and you're in that getting to know each other phase. People are going to talk about what they love, what they don't love, what they hate, what they enjoy, their attitudes and beliefs and values, basically. You subjectively know who you are in that sense. There's also objective knowing, which is really testing out what is true in the world. So in your current environment, what's true, what's not true. We've all been through this, we've been kind of embedded in this whole reality of the COVID-19 pandemic. You have objective knowledge of what's happening. So what have you lost? What have you gained? What are the restrictions on your movements? What kind of things about your life have changed? What do you want them to be? What are they not? That's objective knowing. There's also interpersonal knowing, which sometimes Rogers called phenomenological knowing. I prefer interpersonal. But it's really your understanding of relating to others. Feminist theorists would call this relational knowing. Is really what you're doing is recognizing the interplay of empathy. Again, the feminist theorists are really they really talk more about this idea. But for Rogers, one of the key things that he taught new therapists was empathic understanding is critical to your role as a therapist. You need to show empathic understanding to your client so that your client can rebuild the capacity to show empathic understanding to themselves and to others. So there's interpersonal knowing. Now, given those three ways of knowing about self and knowing about other and knowing about the world, because you're really looking at those three components. So you have knowledge of self, knowledge of objective reality, and knowledge of other. How do we translate that into what Rogers sees as mental health? So for Rogers, the healthiest form of person is what he called a fully functioning person. This is a person who is self-actualized. And he described it as having these 5 basic components to it. The first is this idea of openness. And he felt that people who are at their fullest maturity in their living are open to experiencing new things. They're open to reflection. They don't run away from their emotionality. When challenges come their way, they're open to seeing them as possibility. They don't find them to be a threat to self, and instead they are a possibility for learning. Existential living refers to the idea that people who are well-adjusted, who are fully functioning, who are self-actualizing, they tend to be spontaneous. They tend to function in the world in a way that isn't fear-based. So they look at every moment as an opportunity to grow. And that's a really critical piece. So when you talk about living fully each moment, for Rogers, it's really about every moment is a possibility for growth. And that's really essential. Organismic trusting, again, an awkward phrase that really just means you have to trust intuition to lead you in a growth-promoting direction. Now, this is all assuming that you are functioning with a healthy, not biologically based disorder. So, for example, some critics look at Rogers and say, well, what about a person with basically a biological set point of anxiety, like generalized anxiety disorder, that's biologically caused? Organismic trusting, you're starting in the basement and you can't get to level ground under those conditions. Rogers wasn't really, his theory doesn't really deal with that kind of thing very well. So when you're talking about people like maybe a person on the autism spectrum experiencing the world in an existential way, being fully open to experience, being able to trust your organism for people who are not neurotypical is really difficult. So, critics of Rogers' model may go in that direction. So, back to the model, organismic trusting is really about paying attention to what your intuition is telling you about your inherent potentials and then going with it. Experiential freedom means being able to see yourself as having the capacity for free will, having the capacity for self-direction and self-determination. You can kind of see why Rogers and Skinner were not friends. And they had this long-going battle that really took place in the public sphere, which for their generation, that meant they wrote articles in journals attacking each other, and it wasn't pretty. He believed that people inherently have free will and the capacity for self-determination. And part of being a fully functioning, self-actualized person was experiencing freedom in its authentic form. And finally, fully functioning people, self-actualized people, have the ability to use creativity to live their lives. And he's not talking necessarily about artistic creativity. That's a misunderstanding of Rogers' approach. It's being able to creatively live your life. Life throws crap at people all the time. And the hallmark of fully functioning people is when life throws crap at you, you find a way around and through by using your creativity, by using your intelligence to find solutions, to find new pathways for living well. So what's the alternative to the fully functioning person? Essentially, for Rogers, people become maladjusted, for want of a better word, or they could be described as not self-actualizing when they present in a form that's defensive, essentially when we are forced to be living inauthentically, when we are living under conditions of worth, when we are manifesting a false self. We have to be defensive because you're constantly in a state of trying to defend a lifestyle, a pattern of behaviors, a pattern of thoughts that is not authentic to who you really are. So you function defensively. Since you're living an idealized version of self, you have to have a plan because it's a fake self. It should look this way, so you live in this very narrowly constricted pathway based on that falsehood. You're not going to be listening to your organism because your organism is saying, hello, inherent potential's here, You're not listening to me, and that's when the defenses get really strong and the plan gets reasserted. These are often people, he argued, who, because they spend so much of their time being defensive, living a false plan that's rigid, and internally they are conflicted, they may feel quite manipulated in their lives. So, if it's outside forces that are saying, we really value you when you do these things, and when you do them, you might do them super well, and you're getting all these kudos for living up to this false self. At the same time, you feel awful because you're disregarding your organism. That leaves people feeling manipulated. So you're getting all these rewards for living up to the plan, but the plan is inauthentic. That leaves you feeling manipulated. And worse than that, you feel self-manipulated. It's like, yeah, I'm doing it to myself. What that leaves you with is a person who, from outside standards, may appear to be quite conforming. And Rogers doesn't mean that in a really accusatory way, that you're a boring person, but essentially being common and conforming means you're going to go to the regular solutions to problems. They aren't going to be particularly creative. When the world throws crap at you, you're going to panic because you're going to try the things that used to work, and you're going to keep trying the things that used to work even though they don't work anymore, right? So that's the maladjusted person. Now, Rogers' approach to psychotherapy with people who are maladjusted, his word, not mine, is to reopen the playing field, reset the conditions to unconditional positive regard. So instead of conditions of worth, the person is going to be offered a space where they are given unconditional positive regard. And at first they may find this very uncomfortable, because what they're going to be asked to do is to try and discover who they really are when they've spent sometimes decades constructing a false sense of self in order to live a life that satisfies someone else's plan. They have to deconstruct that and start to reconstruct the capacity to live in the moment, to live without a plan, to pay attention to their organism and what that organism is saying, to live in a way that is free and self-determined, so that they stop feeling manipulated and re-access their creativity in such a way that they can feel powerful again. And that concludes my coverage of Carl Rogers.